It's still May 23rd, 2025. We're going... Oh, are we going to be slow game? We're good? Are we good? Okay. We're going to be doing something different instead of reading... Look, there's a mattress. Somebody's actually sleeping in here. Instead of reading a different... Oh, yeah. I forgot about the... Hold on. I forgot to put on the recording thingy. It's recording now, so we have our transcript that I can then edit to make proper subtitles, and now that I know that we can do that, I will have to go through however many YouTube videos I have and make proper subtitles for them all. Can I not hide under this table at all? They really don't want me to be able to hide in this room. We're going to be reading the fanfiction that I wrote after reading System Collapse. Well, you'll find out when you read it. You don't have to have ominous noises. You don't have to have read it. Let me do this quick.
Reverse, it's Turner. Got to deal with that wasted asshole again. This time he nearly wrecked the door with a maintenance jack. Guess he figures it's safe here. Wants to lock himself in. Screw him. We got too much to worry about without babysitting drunks. Anyway, I threw him in the evidence lockup. Let the son of a bitch sleep it off.
The transcript got all that correctly. So whenever I wave my hands like that, it means you'll have to pause reading that so I can do an audio thing, assuming there's other audio things. I assume you have it open.
Yes.
Okay, yep, we're just gonna be reading a fanfiction that... So, technically an audio fic, or I guess they call them podfics, to be fancy. Where the fuck does pod in podcast come from? Okay. Also, just for the record, because the 20th episode of me failing at this game randomly got like 139 people watching it, I have no idea why. Most of the other videos have like 5, 6, I think the maximum was like 15 or something people watching it, and then the 20th really abruptly has like 139. Oh, good thing I hid in here. There's an Android now. Just for the record, we're both non-binary. We are actual twins running this channel. It's just that I, the person who uses it, its, and skulls pronouns, I'm usually the one doing stuff. And the other one uses they, them pronouns. So I'm giving it over to them because I can't read and, yeah. We might also just die immediately. I'm not sure. But anyways. Yeah, this fanfiction literally just showcasing how easy it is to give these characters actual depth and personality and introduce characters properly to an audience.
Yep.
That was a yep. So anyways. And also just kind of ominous. The more you think about this series, the more ominous ART/arts behavior gets, because Martha Wells doesn't give a fuck about continuity and does not think it's at all strange to reveal to us in later books that everything ART did when it first met Murderbot was a flat-out fucking lie, manipulating Murderbot into thinking that they are on the same level of inexperience and are both panicking just as much, except it's a fucking lie. Martha Wells, she loves doing this. She doesn't really care what the new information she's giving about her characters retroactively puts their first actions we ever see in a horrific light. Anyways. Tariq came to see Murderbot while it was still confined to the med bay, while ART did its best to fix Murderbot's various catastrophic injuries. The fix the broken Murderbot thing was even going... was even slower going than usual, not only because of the extent and nature of Murderbot's injuries, but because ART itself was still recovering from its own ordeal and wasn't back up to normal functionality yet, despite all its bluster to the contrary. Now, Murderbot knew what it was like being on the other end of someone who is very clearly not okay insists it's okay. Disclaimer, I wrote this before I found out that they are, in fact, all cyborgs, not robots, so some parts of this might be outdated, because I hadn't yet comprehended the true horror. Now it kind of felt bad for the humans who had to see it get an arm ripped off while it insisted it was fine. You know, in theory, having a single supercomputer in charge of all the onboard systems of a ship seems like it should be a great idea. In practice, though, it meant that when ART was debilitated, so were all of its systems. The only things functioning normally were things like emergency medkits and other items with their own built-in independent systems. Everything else required ART's control. Before Tariq could come in, he had both knocked on the closed hatch and sent Murderbot a friendly ping on the feed. He didn't know it could see him through the tiny camera drone it left hanging on the ceiling above the door to guard the corridor. ART would have let Murderbot use its camera system, but they were still non-functional, and ART's internal sensors were way too overwhelming for a simple second unit. One thing that should be noted that ART had also told Murderbot One thing that should also be noted was that ART had also told Murderbot Tariq was on his way even before its camera saw him. It was at least nice enough to do that. Even to Murderbot, as bad as it usually was at understanding humans, it was obvious that Tariq wanted to wait outside for it to give him permission to come in, like he would have for any human who was in a private room. That was a nice gesture. Unfortunately, ART opened the door before Murderbot could even think about doing anything, because ART liked to control everything, like the asshole it was. Now that the disaster was mostly over and everyone was starting to relax, it was pretty obvious that ART's humans were trying to practice a make sure it knows it's allowed to say no routine, not only with 3 and 5, but with Murderbot too. ART had told them all about it, apparently. Murderbot wished it hadn't. And of all the humans going out of their way to ask for its consent, a fancy word for permission, which was still getting used to, even after all the time it spent on preservation, before doing things in regard to it would have been really nice if only ART would stop ruining it by making all the decisions anyways, without giving Murderbot a chance to make up its mind one way or the other. It would have liked the opportunity to decide for itself if it wanted to let Tariq in or not, you know. It would have at least been one thing it got to choose in this situation, but it couldn't even have that. We both know you would have opened the door anyways, ART said condescendingly when Murderbot let it feel its annoyance through the feed. Well, I say let it feel its annoyance, but there was really nothing Murderbot could do to stop Art from looking through its brain whenever it wanted, but whatever. And yeah, there was no arguing with ART once it decided it was right, and it always thought it was right. Murderbot still hadn't gotten over the fact that it had to apologize for calling ART a fucker, for fucking kidnapping it and almost getting its humans killed before ART would apologize for doing the exact things Murderbot had called it a fucker for doing. You know, the whole kidnapping thing, which was still ongoing if you really thought about it. They had all been brought there by ART's machinations. Murderbot had just learned that word from a book, against their will. Murderbot still didn't know how many people had died when ART had attacked their research ship. And even if by some absurd miracle everyone had managed to survive, it was indisputable that at least some, if not most, of the humans would develop lasting trauma from the assault, either physical or psychological, or both. Amina had been pinned in place in collapsed laboratory on a ship that was under attack by an unknown hostile, and as far as she'd been aware, the whole vessel could have been torn apart at any moment. The metal that had pinned her down had been too heavy for Conti, the only other survivor in the room with her, to lift, leaving them with no choice but to scream desperately for help while Conti cut her hands and arms bloody, trying to pry the broken door open with a geology chisel. Murderbot could only hope that Conti had gone back to the base ship in time, but there was no way to know. And there was no telling what had happened to the base ship itself and everyone who had been on board. The only ones whose status it knew were firmly in the alive category was Amina and Doctors Averse, Arata, Rathi, and Thiago. All of the adults had suffered from toxic air inhalation among other physical traumas in their attempt to rescue Amina and itself. But they were alive at least. No thanks to ART. Amina was a child who'd been trapped, injured, and afraid for her life. No, that was for dramatic effect. And then she'd witnessed what she thought was Murderbot's violent death and been dragged around by people under the hostile influence of alien artifacts. And then she'd had to watch Murderbot kill those people right in front of her, and not in a way that was intended to be efficient and cause the least amount of pain as possible. There was no other way to describe what it had done. It had gone on a rampage. A violent, bloody, gory rampage. It wasn't Murderbot's finest moment, to say the least. And after witnessing this, Amina had had no one to depend upon for her safety except for Murderbot itself, the one who just murdered people in front of her. And then Ras had died, and Elytra had almost died, and Amina had known that there was something deeply wrong with Murderbot, even while they were still being hunted by more of the brainwashed humans, and the entire time she'd been under the impression that it hated her. And that wasn't even all of the trauma she'd gone through since ART had kidnapped them all. Amina was just one person out of all the people who'd been on their base ship. She was going to spend a lot of time in trauma recovery therapy. And Murderbot hadn't even started processing any of the trauma it had gone through yet. Even stuck inside the med chamber, it was doing everything it could to keep its mind off its injuries and the other events of the past 83 hours.
Ripley, it's Ricardo. You made it.
No thanks to Waits.
He's a ruthless son of a bitch, always has been. Stubborn too. If he'd ever listened to me, things would never have gone this far.
It's done now.
I'm sorry for fucking up with the lockdown earlier.
Forget it. You got me out in the end. I'll see you back at the Bureau.
It couldn't afford to have another mental breakdown when they were still endangered. It had been trying to keep itself busy by talking to Amina when she was awake and reading different versions of ancient legends from Earth. It was very purposefully not watching visual media because that's what ART wanted to do. Even though ART had its crew back, they still couldn't leave because it was the only non-openly murderously hostile way in or out of the system. And it was refusing to leave the system until the mission it had originally come here to do was complete, even though it meant continuing to hold them all as kidnapping victims. And what exactly was that original mission? To steal the planet from the corporation that was trying to claim ownership. Also known as something incredibly high risk and likely to get them fired upon, meaning more threats against the people Murderbot had signed up to protect. Also, to back up a bit and state it for the record, whether or not Murderbot would have also chosen to open the door isn't the point. The point is that it was supposed to be allowed to make decisions for itself, not have ART make them for it. Why did ART constantly parrot parts of the trauma therapy stuff at Murderbot like, check in with your emotions, and ground yourself in the present, if ART wasn't actually going to let Murderbot make decisions for itself? In full offense, what the fuck was the point in Murderbot grounding itself in the present, if the present situation was the reason it needed grounding in the first place? Whatever. At least ART's crew seemed friendly. They didn't approve of ART kidnapping people and kept apologizing while also thanking Murderbot for rescuing them. It thought guilt was part of the reason they kept going out of their way to try and give it a choice in things. It wasn't their fault ART was such an asshole. They clearly couldn't get it to do anything it didn't want to do any more than Murderbot could. Tariq, unaware of the tension his arrival had brought back to the surface, stepped into the room and took a moment to look around at all the empty medical chambers that lined the walls before he finally spotted Murderbot in the far side of the room from the door. The medical chambers were designed so that they could turn to recline or be upright or any position in between. The chamber Murderbot was in had been turned forward so that it was propped mostly upright, so it wouldn't be so awkward for humans to talk to it. And by less awkward, it meant less awkward for it. The humans probably wouldn't have cared. They were all being so gracious and apologetic about the whole sorry our asshole research transport kidnapped you thing. But Murderbot didn't mind. It didn't enjoy eye contact, but it disliked having to look up at humans from lying down even more. Especially while it was in a medical chamber with tiny mechanical arms moving around, trying to sew and cauterize it back together. It had gotten severe burns across its torso in one arm, and the other arm, well, you already know what it had done to its wrist. And if you don't already know, just imagine something horrible and try to not think about it too deeply. It was gross and horrific. That's all you really need to know. It wasn't wearing any clothes because they would have gotten in the way of the med chamber's work. Fortunately, the glass casing could be made opaque, which is a fancy word for not see-throughable, or transparent at will through the feed, so no one would be able to see anything Murderbot didn't want them to. It would have liked to keep the whole thing opaque so they couldn't see anything at all, but ART insisted that Murderbot had to show its face when humans were talking to it, because otherwise it was rude. Again, the ART does whatever it wants, no matter what anyone else says thing. It never seemed to get tired of it. ART was going to do whatever it wanted, and if you didn't like it, you could walk out the airlock anytime you wanted. So Murderbot had no choice in keeping the glass opaque, just like it had no choice in being kidnapped. It opened its eyes to watch the dark coating on the glass vanish within a few moments of Tariq coming through the doorway, giving it a view straight across the room at the empty med chamber on the other side. The blue-gray metal was shiny in the lights from the deep cleaning ART had started of every surface. At the moment, its few functional drones were scrubbing every surface of the air vents and maintenance hatches. The rooms had all been finished so far. Murderbot watched Tariq with another drone ahead inside of the room, since it couldn't currently turn its neck to see him come closer with its eyes. It had exactly 5 drones left, and the other 3 were guarding Amina and the rest of its humans, who were currently all asleep in a giant pile in one of ART's guest quarters. There are a lot of things about humans Murderbot would never understand, and the appeal of cuddling was one of them. It seemed to help them de-stress, which was a good thing at least. Even if Murderbot got viscerally uncomfortable just imagining being in that crowded pile of sleeping bodies. Amina had curled up behind Thiago, who was using one of Rathi's arms as a pillow and holding the other one like it was a lifeline. Rathi's legs had somehow gotten under Overs, who had curled around Arata in what humans called spooning. They had started out covered by a big blanket, but that had long since been pulled mostly off their bed by Amina, who slept only halfway under the remainder. Murderbot didn't know how any of them were comfortable enough to breathe, let alone sleep. Set it to automatically. How do we do that? Okay, well, text speech is going to read the rest, because I am thirsty and this is longer than I thought it was. How long is the big one?
It kept one drone in the room with them, another outside constantly sweeping the corridor, and the third one stationed at the nearest intersection. It was the best it could do with such a short supply. Back in the...
Okay, you start yours recording and I'll put mine on the thing. We'll need the transcript.
The station separation sequence is now complete. Thank you for your patience.
Okay, do you want to play? Okay. What was the keyword? What was the last sentence? Hold on. Technical difficulties. That's why I asked if you wanted to play. Alright, well, I can't play this and read the fic at the same time, and they don't want to play it. So we're just gonna have my phone automatically read it with the robot text-to-speech thing.
Murderbot didn't know how any of them were comfortable enough to breathe, let alone sleep. It kept one drone in the room with them, another outside constantly sweeping the corridor, and the third one stationed at the nearest intersection. It was the best it could do with such a short supply. Back in the medbay, looking through the drone it had inside the room with itself, it seemed to give a little wave when he saw where it was, and began to walk over, visibly wincing every now and then. A lot of ART's crew had gotten injured during the rescue, not just Murderbot and its humans. Humans were a little easier to fix than units, though, since there was nothing proprietary about unaugmented human biology, and none of these humans were augmented, but even once you sealed their wounds, their bodies still had to regrow everything themselves, even when you gave them help to do it. Tariq would probably need 2 more days at least before he was back to normal. Luckily, his injury hadn't been serious, unlike Murderbot's. Murderbot didn't know exactly how Tariq had been injured, because of ART's doctor-patient confidentiality rule. Unless someone's life was directly at risk or it was something Murderbot could detect on its own, ART wasn't going to just go blabbing all the details of the humans' injuries to it without their permission. And asking them for their permission to know just seemed like it would be really awkward. They'd want to know why Murderbot wanted to know, and it didn't actually have any good reason besides the fact that it had gotten used to knowing every single detail about every single person around it, which obviously wouldn't go over well. Though, they might just feel guilty enough about the kidnapping thing to tell it anyways. but there was no point causing more stress in an already stressful situation by pushing it. It turns out that people who actually have a choice in the matter are really unwilling to give up their privacy, they're really attached to the concept. And Murderbot could see why, now that it had had a few fleeting chances to try it itself. Also, living aboard ART, who saw or heard or felt everything that happened, at all times, no matter where you were aboard, they already had to give up a ton of their privacy, so they were even more desperate to cling to what few scraps they still had left. So Murderbot resigned itself to not knowing. But hey, at least Tariq was clearly less injured than he'd been when Murderbot first met him, so that was something. It didn't like being around seriously injured humans, because it set off all kinds of residual programming that made it think it was going to be punished for not protecting them well enough.
Disclaimer, I wrote this before I found that interview. That interview with capital letters. Just for the record. This is just me showing basic understanding of how you write a capitalist dystopia.
It didn't like being around seriously injured humans, because it set off all kinds of residual programming that made it think it was going to be punished for not protecting them well enough. And it already had enough anxiety to deal with. It didn't need to have any more panic attacks today, thank you very much. Tariq walked closer, and Murderbot mentally reviewed what it already knew about him to try and prepare itself for whatever was about to happen. It knew from its earlier calculations when ITD first seen Tariq that he was around average height for a human, which meant he was shorter than Murderbot even when it was leaning slightly backwards, and he had longer dark hair that he let curl loosely around his head, whereas Murderbot kept it as short as humanly possible. If it had been able to stop it from growing at all, it would have. But unlike humans, there's no part of it that wasn't locked behind a million company patents. And apparently whoever had come up with the design for company units had really not wanted them to ever be completely hairless. If Murderbot even tried physically shaving or lasering its head hair off, it would just grow back instantly.
Something's been up with the damn androids since I got here.
No, this is new. They've left their posts. I just saw someone in the public area. That's not normal.
Great.
Watch your back.
Poor Ripley sounds so tired, and it's gonna get so much worse. I'll try to pause it whenever the NPCs talk, but I don't have it memorized, so there'll be some overlap.
If Murderbot even tried physically shaving or lasering its head hair off, it would just grow back instantly. And if it kept trying, it'd just drain its batteries from the hair having to be continuously synthesized. It hoped whoever made that decision, and put so many locks on keeping it in place, died a slow, painful, humiliating death. Also unlike Murderbot, Tariq had facial hair, because some humans really like having lots of hair on their bodies, including on their face. It was a black beard and mustache that went around his mouth and nose, and up the sides of his jaw all the way to his ears. Murderbot was at least glad the company hadn't. T decided that units had to have hair like that on their faces. One interesting thing though was that Tariq used special aromatic oils on it so that he always smelled nice. Murderbot hadn't even known you could do that. Tariq's skin was also lighter than Murderbot's, more towards the tan side of the spectrum rather than dark brown. It was an interesting comparison to make, when most of your skin was currently in the process of being regrown. Since Murderbot was a construct, its endoskeleton was made of metal instead of bone, with a mix of organic and mechanic materials around it. Its skin was normally dark brown.
Yeah, that doesn't apply anymore now that I know that Murderbot has been a cyborg this whole time, and Martha Wells just decided to hide that fact so we wouldn't think about what it means. Because she's like Stephen Moffat in the worst way possible.
Its skin was normally dark brown, but while it was in the process of being synthesized for repair, it always started out transparent like glass, and if you sat there and stared long enough, which it had done a few times out of morbid curiosity, you'd actually be able to watch its veins growing a new network, carrying the blue or purple fluids necessary for its various functions. Like I said, it was interesting to compare skin tones when most of yours was currently non-existent. Murderbot was definitely envious of the ability humans had of naturally regenerating their damaged skin, and even their bones, without even having to put any conscious effort into it. They could even fight off diseases all by themselves. Whereas if you were unlucky enough to be a unit, or a human with proprietary augments, well, then you got the short end of the stick, and had to rely on outside technology for all of your repairs and upkeep. And it usually didn't come cheap. At the moment, Tariq was wearing one of ART's dark blue, casual crew uniforms, long soft pants with a lot of pockets to store things in, and a long-sleeved shirt, with the logo for ART's University on the back. Before Murderbot Diaries needed to be confined to the medchamber, ART had given it one of the same uniforms, since the kidnapping assault had destroyed its original clothes with burns, bullet holes, blood, and its own internal fluids. Tariq stopped at what was considered a polite distance, standing mostly in front of Murderbot, but slightly off to the side, so that it could continue to stare straight ahead at the empty medchamber without having to look directly at him. He'd clearly spoken to Rafi about its aversion to eye contact at some point while it was unconscious. He asked, "Hi, Sec Unit, have a moment to talk?" Of course it did. It's not like it had anything else to do besides vehemently, another word Murderbot had recently learned, avoid watching more reruns of visual media with ART, but it knew at this point that humans just ask these things to be polite and as an easy way to start a conversation. Tariq wasn't literally asking if Murderbot could talk, but asking if it wanted to. He was asking for its consent. Murderbot had to wait for one of the medical arms to move away from its jaw so it wouldn't crush it before it could say, hopefully sounding casual, "Go ahead." Its voice was projected out of a speaker on the outside of the medical chamber, so Tariq could hear it even though the thick plates of glass that kept the interior sterile. Murderbot hadn't been given any reason to dislike him personally, so it was curious about what he wanted. At least this time ART didn't try to answer for it. Murderbot had the drone on the ceiling move around to behind itself so that it could look at Tariq's face through the camera lens.
I don't know when anyone will get this, but someone needs to keep a record, and I don't know. I came here a few months ago to write about the collapse of a dream, a future gone sour. For me, the people here were little more than footnotes for my article. Something to tug at the heartstrings. And when the disappearances started, I was thrilled. This was something big. But now people are afraid, and a communications fault means we're alone. I'm trapped here, just like everybody else. Another footnote. Another victim.
It's Ripley. What's going on with the androids?
I don't know.
What about the change in alert status?
Damn it, I don't know. I'm trying to contact Samuels. Maybe he knows what the hell Apollo is playing at.
Hold on, I forgot to turn the microphone back on, so it wouldn't do that, so I'm just gonna rewind. Rip to you guys. You can read it on the Internet Archive at fanfiction.net.
He asked, "Hi, Sec Unit, have a moment to talk?" Of course it did. It's not like it had anything else to do besides vehemently, another word Murderbot had recently learned, avoid watching more reruns of visual media with ART, but it knew at this point that humans just ask these things to be polite and as an easy way to start a conversation. Tariq wasn't literally asking if Murderbot could talk, but asking if it wanted to. He was asking for its consent. Murderbot had to wait for one of the medical arms to move away from its jaw so it wouldn't crush it before it could say, hopefully sounding casual, "Go ahead." Its voice was projected out of a speaker on the outside of the medical chamber, so Tariq could hear it even though the thick plates of glass that kept the interior sterile. Murderbot hadn't been given any reason to dislike him personally, so it was curious about what he wanted. At least this time ART didn't try to answer for it. Murderbot had the drone on the ceiling move around to behind itself so that it could look at Tariq's face through the camera lens. It was easier to understand human expression this way, since Murderbot could filter the video directly through its behavior recognition software, and it didn't feel so overwhelming. It was almost like putting a filter between it and the real interaction, so it didn't feel as much pressure. Tariq smiled. Murderbot recognized it as being friendly and relaxed. Tariq stuck one hand inside his pants pocket and leaned slightly on one leg, and said, gesturing with his other hand along with his words, I know Perihelion has probably already said who I am, but I wanted to introduce myself anyways. I am really bad with names and faces, so I try to make sure I get to meet everyone so I'll have less chance of mixing them up later. Sorry if that happens, just remind me and I'll try to remember. He shrugged one shoulder in what was an apologetic sort of way, according to Murderbot's drone's behavior algorithm and its own experiences so far, and Tariq said again, I've just always been bad at recognizing people. Murderbot had a hard time imagining what it would be like not to be able to remember everything you'd ever seen in exact detail, but it knew organic memory storage didn't work as well as mechanical. Humans, or at least, unaugmented ones at least, didn't get to consciously pick and choose which memories they kept and which ones faded. Anyways, Tariq inclined his head slightly. My name's Tariq, no last name. I'm neo-male, and my pronouns are he, him, his, himself. It's nice to say hi. I just wanted to say thanks for saving my life, and say I'm sorry for the injuries. He gestured towards the med chamber, in case there was any confusion, and I hope they heal well. He seemed sincere, and Murderbot don't know why that was still surprising. Most of the humans it'd been around lately were usually sincere. And ART.
Just for the record, I don't know why it's having such problems with contractions lately. It hasn't ever had problems with these, except for like in the past month or so. It's weird.
And ART's crew had so far been nothing but apologetic and sympathetic. It said, you're welcome. Instead of anything else it could have said in this particular situation, because ART had been nudging it in the feed to take credit where credit was due, and wouldn't let up until Murderbot said something that would accept the gratitude, as though it had really been Murderbot's choice. It added, it wasn't your fault I got hurt, but then KS. It left the part of whose fault it actually was carefully and pointedly unspoken. ART knew exactly who it was talking about. Tariq smiled again, looking pleased. Then he tilted his head to the side a little, almost like he was overmoting to make his meaning clear, but a quick glance at ART's offered memories showed Murderbot this was normal behavior for Tariq, as he said, lowering his voice slightly, as though he were about to say something private, and I just wanted to double-check K, the pronouns are it's itself, right? I heard other people saying it, but I just wanted to make certain. Whatever he'd been about to say was suddenly cut off, because the first part of that statement had offended ART, slamming into the conversation before.
I'm just gonna read the rest out loud, because I'm gonna procrastinate this part of the game. It's gonna be so scary. It could be worse though. Apparently there's a mod that makes the androids run. I don't know how you can make that. So yes, we are just gonna sit in here and be a scaredy cat for the rest of this video, at least until I get bored. Anyways, whatever. Okay, I guess me putting this on my phone as just a regular document instead of EPUB to put random spaces in. I'm just gonna go back to paragraph 2. We drink some tea first. has some androids? Tariq smiled again, looking pleased. Then he tilted his head to the side a little, almost like he was over-emoting to make his meaning clear, but a quick glance at Art's awkward memories showed Murderbot this was normal behavior for Tariq, and he said, lowering his voice slightly as though he were about to say something private, "And I just wanted to double-check. The pronouns are it, its, itself, right? I heard other people saying it, but I just wanted to make sure." Whatever he'd been about to say was suddenly cut off because the first part of that statement had offended Art, who came slamming into the conversation before Murderbot could stop it, demanding in that overpoweringly aggressive way it had, "Are you accusing me of misgendering Sec Unit?" It should probably be explained that there wasn't really such a thing as volume in the feed, not the way you'd think of sound, because the feed isn't actually using sound at all, but you could increase the intensity of the message, and humans tended to say that made it louder or quieter if you were decreasing the intensity. In that aspect, Art was being very loud when it said this. It was the feed equivalent of someone slamming their fist onto a table and shouting in your face. And the aggression was very plain, as much as ART later proclaimed it hadn't been aggressive at all, and Murderbot and Tariq were just both being childish to think so. Tariq was so startled he actually fell over in his instinctive attempt to get away from the sudden, scary noise. But the noise was coming from inside his own head, so his reaction was extremely confused, and he ended up tripping over his own legs and falling into the wall, which, thankfully, wasn't far, since they were at the end of the room. Murderbot's drone could see and hear Tariq's heart rate spiking and his clear anxiety, and the anxiety was entirely justified. ART had pretty much done the same thing to Murderbot when they'd first met, and it had been so terrified it considered initiating a shutdown, thinking ART was going to kill it, what with the whole threatening to fry its brain thing. There was something that felt viscerally wrong to Murderbot to see ART treat one of its own crew members like this, something that felt deeply uncomfortable to the permanent remnants of its protects humans at all costs programming, along with its general, morals. It was one thing to treat Murderbot like this. It was just a Sec Unit, after all, and it was even sort of reasonable for it not to care about the safety of Murderbot's humans, because they weren't its crew. But it was another thing for ART to do this to one of its crew, a human Murderbot had been almost killed trying to rescue, a human ART was supposed to care about enough to justify kidnapping Murderbot and putting its humans at risk. There was no way it was an accident. ART knew more about how to use the feed and communicate with humans than Murderbot had ever forgotten. And yes, it did still feel betrayed about how much ART had lied to it when they'd first met, pretending it didn't understand human body language as much as it really did, so they could bond over frantically figuring out it out together, while Murderbot was the only one actually panicking. Okay, I'm just gonna have it read the rest, so we can do stuff in the game.
Murderbot felt like ART had just been toying with it the entire time, which just hurt all the worse, because it distrusted ART. Stop it. It snapped, unsure if it was still yelling at Tariq on a private section of the feed. His face had gone pale, and he had one hand over his heart. He could probably feel it pounding in his chest with adrenaline the way Murderbot could hear it. Murderbot said, that was uncalled for. It was an attempt to turn ART's usual patronization back onto it to shame it into stopping, but it didn't work. Usually it was ART saying that to Murderbot, usually because Murderbot was angry at it for just this sort of thing, and had called it what it was, an asshole. Perry Helion, don't do that. Tariq managed to say at that moment, pushing himself back off the wall to stand upright, staring warily up at the ceiling, unable to hide the way he was cringing slightly, clearly expecting it to happen again. I didn't even know you were listening. I thought this was a private conversa. He had to pause, still slightly breathless. Quote, and, no, I'm not accusing you of misgendering Sec Unit, I just, ONC again. He was cut off by ART demanding, loudly, angrily, you don't trust me to know what Sec Unit's pronouns are. Tariq winced, but held his ground this time. It was easier to resist when you were expecting it. After a moment where Murderbot could only assume ART had said something to him privately, Tariq looked over toward it with a sad, apologetic expression. "I'm sorry for offending you, Sec Unit, I'll just leave you alone." Obviously he thought ART was being a bitch on Murderbot's behalf, and just as obviously, ART had made him think that. Tariq started towards the door, walking fast, clearly wanting to avoid any more of ART's wrath. But Murderbot called him back through the speaker on its medchamber. "Hold on, Tariq, ART's the one who's offended, not me. It needs to mind its own business and shut the fuck up. I don't want you to leave." It sent him the same friendly ping he'd sent it earlier for emphasis. It felt very odd to actually tell a human it wanted to continue interacting with them when they were trying to leave. This was the first time it had ever done it. Murderbot's voice came out sounding normal and even-toned, not because it was calm, but because it was too physically exhausted to raise its voice or emote, even though internally it was furious. Tariq stopped, and turned back to look towards it, hesitating, shooting anxious glances towards the ceiling, waiting for another outburst. "I don't blame him," Murderbot said out loud. "ART, fuck off and leave us alone. This is supposed to be a private conversation." Out of both spite and necessity, it pulled away all its feed connections to ART that it could, and resigned itself to having to ignore the barrage of pings and messages ART instantly started bombarding it with. The activity in its medchamber stalled for half a moment as apparently most of ART's energy was redirected into slamming it for attention. Yeah, that was doing nothing to help its anger or its exhaustion. To Tariq, it said, doing its best to ignore the selfish, entitled, bully of an elephant in the room, "What did you want to ask me?" Before ART had interrupted him twice, it had seemed like Tariq had more questions to ask. And since ART didn't want to let him ask them, Murderbot did. ART had already let him in without Murderbot getting to choose, so it at least wanted to be able to answer his questions itself, even if the answer was going to be a simple, fuck off, if he was going to be one of those people who tried to convince it to change its pronouns to real pronouns and stop hating itself by using the pronouns it actually liked, that actually represented its gender. It still didn't understand why people try to insist that they, them, their, theirs, themselves pronouns W or E interchangeable with it, itself, when if that were true, they clearly wouldn't be so vehemently against using its actual, itself pronouns. But logic always flew out the window when bigotry was the subject, so Murderbot don't know why it still bothered to be surprised. But even with ART's outbursts clearly scaring him, Tariq didn't seem like the sort of person who would try to harass Murderbot into changing its pronouns. It wanted to hear what he wanted to ask. It was curious, and not just out of spite for ART. Tariq came back again, still clearly nervous, and stood in the same spot as before, a polite distance away, slightly to the side so Murderbot wouldn't have to look directly at him or close its eyes. He was still trying to prioritize Murderbot's comfort even with ART being such an asshole, which increased Murderbot's level of something for him.
I don't want to have to sneak past all these fucking androids. Okay. They definitely were not friends, but he sort of seemed like he could be a friend if ART would stop sabotaging his attempts to be nice. "Sorry about ART being an asshole," Murderbot said, feeling like it should be apologizing for some absurd reason, even though it didn't make any sense. Tariq lived aboard ART. He should know better than Murderbot, and it definitely was not Murderbot's fault ART was an asshole, even if it was currently being an asshole and pretending it was on Murderbot's behalf. But Tariq looked kind of confused by its statement, and Murderbot remembered that he probably didn't know what the anagram stood for. It explained, "I call it Asshole Research Transport since it didn't tell me its name was Perihelion when we first met. It did not mention all the other things ART hadn't told it when they first met." "Ah," Tariq said simply, and it was very clear just from the way he said it that he agreed with the assessment. ART, along with spamming Murderbot, was now also doing its usual ominously looming in the feed routine. Sarcasm. Totally not creepy at all. Definitely not asshole behavior. End sarcasm. Murderbot could practically feel it leaning against the walls it had put up, not in the kind of way where ART was trying to break them down, but just casually applying enough pressure that Murderbot would remember it could at any time. Sort of like someone not trying to break your arm, but gripping you tightly enough that they left a bruise, and it was completely beyond question that they could break your arm if they wanted to. Yeah, like I said, asshole. What were you saying before ART threw a fit? Murderbot asked. Now its utter exhaustion came in handy because its voice came out sounding all calm and dignified, which made ART look worse. In response, ART abruptly stopped spamming it and let go of its walls, as though this would somehow prove that ART wasn't throwing a fit or being a creep, as though stopping doing the bad thing meant the bad thing hadn't happened. Tariq, unaware of the battle going on beyond his perception, grimaced, clearly bracing himself. Well, he started, then paused, waiting for ART's expected interruption. They waited a moment or two in relative silence, where the only sounds were his heart beating, Murderbot's internal gyros, and the soft whir of the med chamber's arms still working on it. At least Murderbot had one not completely asshole-ish thing to say about ART's behavior here. It hadn't stopped trying to heal Murderbot. Through its drone, Murderbot could actually see Tariq's heartbeat slowing back down to normal. When the tantrum didn't immediately explode again, Tariq continued, still hesitant. Okay, well, it's two things I want to clarify. First, I've heard other people just say it, no other versions so far, so I wanted to ask if the pronouns are it's itself, or is it another variation? Murderbot didn't know if Tariq was aware of it, but he was still stooping slightly. Instinctively and apparently unconsciously, he was trying to get further away from the ceiling, where humans tended to visualize ART's presence being located. He kept wincing, too, not just from expectation, but from the pain of his injuries, which just made Murderbot even more pissed off at ART than it already was. But Murderbot was confused by what he was trying to ask. Another variation? It asked. In the feed, it opened its wall just long enough to send ART a vehement, "fuck you," before it closed it again. Tariq, unaware of the side comment, nodded, this time sticking both his hands in his pockets. Apparently Murderbot wasn't the only one who didn't know what to do with its hands when it was nervous. Tariq said, I used to know a neo-NB whose pronouns were it, ita, its, it has, ita self, and a man whose pronouns were it, him, her, themself, and a woman who only used it for every pronoun, and a lot of other people who use it, itself, so I just wanted to check which set to use so I wouldn't use the wrong ones by mistake. I figured it would be more polite to ask directly instead of going through the others. He shrugged one shoulder as he sent another cautious glance toward the ceiling and added, probably just as aware as Murderbot was that ART was listening to every word they said, I really don't like talking about people behind their backs, and I'd rather get pronoun info right from the source. No offense is intended to anyone. Huh. It hadn't ever occurred to Murderbot that other pronoun sets that included it existed, nor it had ever heard about anyone using a specific combination set like it, him, her, themself. It took Murderbot a few long, awkward seconds to realize that Tariq wanted it to answer his question now. My pronouns are it, itself, it said, suddenly more than a little dazed by how considerate he'd been in asking. And maybe also dazed from the catastrophic wounds it still had, coupled with the stress of ART's spam attack and ominous looming. Those things weren't great for an already injured Murderbot. But part of it was also definitely from surprise. No human, or bot, or anyone else had ever asked it this kind of question before. But wait, he'd said he had two things to ask. Now Murderbot was really curious. And even more angry at ART for trying to chase him away before he could ask. What's the second part? Ah. Tariq took one hand out of his pocket and moved over to lean against the wall. Maybe because he just wanted to, maybe because he was afraid of falling into it again. Maybe it hurt less to lean against the wall. Murderbot didn't know and didn't ask. Well, he said, I wanted to check. Another Neo-NB I knew always wanted to be referred to as it, with no name and never referred to as you, even when it was being spoken to directly. If one wanted to refer to it in particular, one would say the Neo-NB, or if there was more than one Neo-NB in the group, the Neo-NB with the constellation over its eye. It always referred to itself in the third person. I wanted to check if that was something preferable. I'm fine with being called you, or by my name or pronouns, by the way. Well, that explained the strange way he'd been structuring his sentences. This was the first time Murderbot had actually spoken to him outside of the life and death situation they'd been thrown into, where he'd said exactly 18 words within Murderbot's range of hearing, so it had been assuming the way he was speaking now was just a quirk of his. But no, he was actually being really nice and trying to find out if it was a quirk of Murderbot's. And to think ART had tried to kill this conversation before it could even get interesting. It's okay to call me you, Murderbot said. I've never heard of someone using pronouns that way. Not even in all of its media. Not too many have, Tariq said, but I've met half a dozen at this point, so I like to double check with the person before I make assumptions, and I want to make sure everyone knows I'll use their pronouns the way they want, even if it seems unconventional, or if other people have told them it's too much of a hassle. Thank you for letting me know. Is it alright if I ask another question? I know how tiring it can be to be in a med chamber, so I don't want to tire you out. He seemed slightly more relaxed now that ART hadn't interrupted or gone on the offensive again. Murderbot's batteries couldn't actually run out while it was hooked up to ART's systems unless there was an even bigger disaster than any of them were prepared for, so it said, "Go ahead, I'm fine." Well, not technically fine, but it was healing, and talking wouldn't make it any worse, so... Also, it didn't have anything else to do besides read as a way of pointedly not watching media, which wasn't as fun as reading because it actually wasn't in the mood to watch media. And this conversation had turned out more interesting than it had thought it would be. It could still feel ART looming in the feed, for the record, making its presence known at least to Murderbot. It didn't know if Tariq could feel it. Now, less like someone crushing your arm and more like standing uncomfortably close and breathing down your neck. But at least this time it wasn't flashing the lights at Murderbot in code to force it to talk to it like last time they'd had a fight just hours earlier, or demanding Murderbot apologize for being rightfully upset for being rightfully kidnapped, right? Tariq continued, "Are there any kinds of words you'd prefer I use to refer to you, and any words you want me to avoid? For instance, although I do identify as male, I prefer to be called an X instead of a man, if it ever comes up. Are there any particular ways you want me to refer to you? Sort of like that?" To avoid confusion, if you're visually reading this instead of listening to the audio log, Tariq pronounced, what is going on, document? The document is glitching. Alright, let me just go back. Document is glitching. For instance, although I do identify as male, I prefer to be called a Zan instead of a man, if it ever comes up. Are there any particular ways you want me to refer to you, sort of like that? To avoid confusion, if you're visually reading this instead of listening to the audio log, Tariq pronounced the X in the word Zan, X-A-N, as a Z sound, so that it sounds like Zan, Z-A-N, rhyming with man, M-A-N. He was asking, did Murderbot want to be called a woman, or a man, or an NB, or a Nemen, or a Fane, or an Androgyne, or an Othran, or any of the other 1,000,001 gender terms it had cataloged throughout its waking memory. Usually when someone asked for its gender, Murderbot put indeterminate or not applicable, depending on the circumstances. But gender itself wasn't the exact same thing as the gender terms he was asking about. It didn't think it could actually be called an indeterminate, the way humans could be called a woman, or a man, or an NB, or a Tercera, or any of the countless others. Note from future Murderbot to everyone listening to or reading this. Yes, that is literally an option. As of now, Murderbot prefers to be called an indeterminate, the way other people call themselves a man, woman, Nemen, Androgyne, or you get the picture. But obviously it didn't know that at the time or realized that it could have literally just asked to be called that. In Murderbot's defense, no one had ever actually asked it this question before, and it had never seen anything in its media to prepare it for the question. It had had people ask for its name, which it never gave them, and it had people ask for its pronouns. Sometimes they asked for its gender itself, and in its media, people asked those kinds of questions all the time. But they never asked it what gender terms it wanted to be called. Murderbot could think a lot faster than a human, but even it couldn't think fast enough to come up with an answer to this unforeseen question in a reasonable amount of time. There were so many options, and it hated a lot of them. So instead it said, to stall for a few more moments. And then it still couldn't think of anything. There were still too many options, even when it sorted out the ones it automatically hated. It'd have to test them all out individually by thinking about itself in the third person to see what it liked and didn't like, and crap, that was asking a lot when it wasn't at optimal performance capability. It couldn't stall any longer, so it ended up saying, I don't really know. I just know I don't want to be referred to anything involving human genders. My gender is indeterminate. Sometimes, Murderbot wondered what its life would have been like if it hadn't said this. Tariq frowned a little, but when he spoke, he sounded just as confused. He just sounded confused. What do you mean exactly by human genders? For a few seconds, Murderbot's mind went blank. What did he mean he didn't know what human genders were? Wasn't it obvious? Like, male and female, it said awkwardly. I don't want to ever be called a man or a woman or anything to do with those. It was still busy trying to sort through all the gendered terms it had ever heard, which was not helped in any way by ART deciding to start spamming it again. Probably trying to be helpful by throwing another million terms at it. Murderbot didn't know because it deleted all of the messages the instant it got them, and then dumped the trash bin for good measure. Tariq, however, was unaware of the multitasking Murderbot was doing, and it's not like it had given him any indication of what it was doing either, or like multitasking wasn't perfectly normal. Murderbot just wanted to make it clear that this conversation was going on two very different levels. It wasn't sure if that was even relevant, but whatever. It's its audio log, it could do whatever it wanted. Anyways, Tariq tilted his head, still frowning. Well, he said slowly, female and male aren't really human genders. They come from the old gender binary, but they're not unique to humans. I've known a lot of bots who are male or female, but I think I understand what you mean. You don't want terms relating to male or female use for you, right? Well, needless to say, Murderbot absolutely did not believe him. About the I've known bots who were male or female part, not the I get what you mean part. That's impossible, it said. Sarcasm. Great response. It knows. Give it up for Murderbot, the best interlocutor ever constructed. End sarcasm. Tariq spent a moment actually blinking silently the way people do in memes. It was so surprising and funny that Murderbot had to pause its search to focus on his face and make a looping gif, which of course it would never show to anyone but itself. Then Tariq said, clearly confused, "What's impossible?" What the hell kind of question was that? Murderbot said, in the tone people on TV did when speaking to a young child who doesn't know anything, "Bots can't have genders." It knows. It knows. ART decided that was the moment it was going to stop pretending Murderbot actually had a choice in not listening to it, because it cut into its feed like it was tissue paper to say, "You cannot be serious." "Shut up," Murderbot replied, not bothering to try kicking it out. There was no point in wasting more of its energy trying to keep Art out when Murderbot knew it could just break down its feed walls whenever it wanted. ART said, more insistently, "That is not how gender works." I said, "Shut up!" ART was not impressed. "I'm literally non-binary, and I know that's not how this works." "Fuck off!" That's really not true, Tariq said, unaware of the argument he was missing out on. Sometimes Murderbot wonders if it would be nicer not to have any feed connection at all. You only have to deal with one thing at a time. 9JX might have the right idea after all. Tariq asked, "What makes you think that?" Murderbot could tell his tone was meant to be diplomatic because he clearly didn't agree with Murderbot and also, just as clearly, didn't want to make it mad. He hadn't actually taken a step backwards, but he'd shifted his body slightly away from Murderbot, like he was no longer overjoyed to be having this conversation. Not that he'd been overjoyed to begin with, but you know what I mean. Asking for Murderbot's pronouns? Great. Asking for its gendered terms? A confusing novelty, but also good. This? asking it to explain the concept of human genders and why they couldn't be applied to non-humans? Murderbot really did not want to have this conversation with anyone, let alone a human, but it was still a better alternative than having to put up with ART's current bullcrap without any other distractions. Also, it literally could not understand why Tariq and Art were acting like it was being ridiculous. The answer seemed so obvious to it, so it decided to cut straight through what it thought was pure bullshit and get straight to the point. Bots don't have penises or vaginas. And its logic went that you couldn't have a gender unless you had one of those. It seemed really obvious to Murderbot, and it was hoping to gross Tariq out by not using any euphemisms. Humans invented euphemisms to avoid embarrassment, right? Well, it didn't work. Apparently, some humans aren't grossed out by those words when you're using them for this kind of conversation. They grossed Murderbot out no matter what the context, so it assumed that's how it was for everyone. Yes, you may have noticed that Murderbot has a problem with making assumptions like that. Well, just you wait and see, because this is just the start. Well, that's not really true either, Tariq said in response, which was the complete opposite of any reply Murderbot had imagined, completely throwing all of its trains of thoughts so quickly its mind almost literally stalled for half a fraction of a second. But Tariq was already continuing to speak like this bombshell he'd just dropped on Murderbot was perfectly normal information and not groundbreaking in any way. True, bots can't have purely organic versions like humans or constructs can, but there are mechanical versions that... Whoa. What? What was even happening now? What was he talking about? What? Murderbot scrambled to salvage some semblance of totally not flipping out in its exhausted, bewildered state, and it could just tell ART was laughing at it even though it hadn't actually said anything yet. But Tariq didn't stop for Murderbot's catastrophically derailed trains of thought, so it had to stop them itself and actually pay attention to what he was saying, because he was still talking. Can be made, and anyways, having or not having one of those kinds of genitalia doesn't determine your gender. You can be any gender and have a penis or a vagina or both, or something else entirely, or nothing at all. Gender is a lot more complicated than just checking what kind of genitals someone has. Anyone, including humans, bots, and constructs, and anyone else, can be any gender they want, regardless of what kind of genitals they do or do not have. To say this was shocking to Murderbot would be an understatement. I feel like I should explain that this made Murderbot incredibly, absolutely angry, specifically because it had always defined its lack of gender on its lack of genitals. It was the defense it pulled out when a human started trying to misgender it, but now Tariq seemed to be saying that defense wasn't actually as rock solid as it thought it was. Because if what Tariq was saying was true, and spoiler alert from the future, it literally is true, then that meant that Murderbot didn't have to be genderless just because it didn't have any genitals. And acknowledging that fact made it feel like it was opening itself up to having its gender questioned and put up for debate, like it would mean people were now allowed to misgender it and harass it, which it literally wasn't, but that's how it made Murderbot feel at the time. Murderbot's insecure, terrified logic was, if I can't define my lack of gender by my lack of genitals, then can I even define it at all? If genderlessness isn't real because of my lack of genitals proves it, then can literally anything prove it? Yeah, hello from the future again. The answer is yes, obviously. Murderbot's gender was proved by it telling you that's what it is. That's what the social part of gender is a social construct means. That's how it works for everyone. But Murderbot didn't realize this at the time, so it was pretty much flipping the fuck out. Well, mentally at least, not really physically. It was still too injured to move even if it had wanted to, even if it wasn't being restrained by the med chamber. If it had been able to move, it would totally not have run out of the room, or at least shoved itself into a corner to stare at the wall. It was actually so physically weak that even the panic flooding its mind wasn't enough to kickstart its systems into high gear. Yeah, its injuries were that bad. The only reason Murderbot was even able to be conscious at all was because ART was feeding it enough power to avoid involuntary shutdown, and was helping to regulate its automatic functions that couldn't function by themselves. Also, yes, this is exactly as horrifying a situation to be in as you'd imagine it would be when your life support system was also the one who got you hurt in the first place and Murderbot quoted the trauma recovery therapy group, violating your autonomy. You know, that incredibly precious resource which 99.99% of Murderbot's life had been lacking. That autonomy. And see, if ART hadn't been acting like such an enormous asshole, Murderbot could at least have opaqued the rest of the med chamber's glass so that Tariq couldn't see its face anymore. But when it tried to do exactly that, ART stopped it immediately and set an even firmer lock on the control to prevent Murderbot from trying again. Very much like someone smacking a kid's hand away from something they couldn't be trusted with. Yeah, that did not fucking help at all with any of the problems ongoing in this situation. The fact that Tariq was being nice enough to not actually look directly at Murderbot was beside the point. Murderbot closed its eyes so it could at least stop seeing organically. ART couldn't stop it from doing that. It could cut off Murderbot's camera access through its drones, but it couldn't override Murderbot's actual eyes, not unless it wanted to literally use one of the medical arms to pry its eyelid open, and if ART tried that, well, let's just say Murderbot wouldn't be offering any apologies for what it did afterward. Murderbot ended up expressing the little gender/excruciating lack of autonomy crisis it was currently suffering from by getting even more angry than it already was, because being angry felt safer than being afraid. It snapped in a much weaker and not at all intimidating voice than it wanted. "That's bullshit. You don't know anything about it. You're just a human. You don't understand us." By us, it meant bots and constructs as a whole, which was completely dishonest of it because, as it may already be clear, Murderbot hated being lumped in with robots like they were exactly the same thing. They weren't. Bots were purely mechanical, constructs like Murderbot were both mechanical and organic. They might both be robots and have some problems in common, but there are also distinct differences between them and different kinds of problems they have to deal with that don't overlap. Murderbot hated when people lumped them together like they were exactly the same thing, just because they weren't human. Cough, cough, cough. I have to once again interrupt again to reiterate. I wrote this before finding out that Murderbot is a cyborg, so this is outdated. But anyways, let's continue. But being a bigot, which to be clear is exactly what Murderbot was doing, usually requires you to be a hypocrite, so it threw out that little grievance out the airlock faster than you can say, President Lysandros, once it decided it wasn't convenient to its argument. You see, Murderbot was placing itself as the authority on all the genders of all robots and saying that no one who wasn't one of us could understand it or know more about it than Murderbot could, because Murderbot had appointed itself the ultimate expert and arbiter. You may have noticed the tiny little giant gaping hole in this plan of its. Tariq already knew more about bot and construct genders than Murderbot did, which had just been established like 20 seconds before Murderbot said this load of absolute bullshit. Yeah, bigotry doesn't exactly lend itself to rational argument. Through Murderbot's drone's cameras, Murderbot could see that Tariq's response to this bullcrap was to raise his eyebrows with all due, "Are you serious right now? We literally just established that I know more about this than you do, like 5 seconds ago." I don't blame him. He must have had better self-control than Murderbot did, because he said, without getting outwardly angry, "I understand what my bot friends told me." He said it very coolly and calmly. It should be noted that Murderbot was not in any way calm, and they made it very clear that their genders were real, regardless of whether or not they had the genitalia to match. We had many hours-long conversations going into the details and talking about all the theory. Some of them even wrote books on the subject. He had lifted his hands to do an air quotes around the word match for extra emphasis, in case Murderbot still didn't understand how much the word was not actually relevant to this conversation. Well, it was starting to. That was the whole problem. It did not help Murderbot calm down when ART butted in with, "Did you seriously think that just because we both happen to use the same pronouns, that this was proof of all bots and constructs universally using those pronouns and are just as genderless as you are? I'm literally not even agender. I'm just non-binary. I personally know dozens of bots of all kinds who use all kinds of pronouns and are all kinds of genders, including the binary genders of male and female." Yeah, that didn't help. Well, I mean, it did in one way, because it was further proof that Murderbot had no clue what it was talking about and needed to drastically overhaul its views of the world in in general and gender in specific, but what I mean is it didn't help it calm down at all. ART said exasperatedly, "What about the transports who gave you rides before you met me, and all the other bots who helped you escape? Did you seriously not ask them for their pronouns? Did you really just assume they all used its too?" It was a good thing Murderbot was in the medical chamber, because the way its organic parts were behaving, it would have been very bad for it in its current state otherwise. And by really bad, I mean it probably would have been killed from the stress. What with, being ripped open and burned and all. Murderbot was so viscerally uncomfortable it had to just lie there for, I kid you not, a good 30 seconds, doing nothing but trying to get its emotions back under control. It wasn't used to feeling guilty. By some miracle, it ended up asking a rational question instead of initiating a shutdown to try and get out of the conversation. If it had had the opportunity to throw itself at an airlock at that moment, it probably would have taken it just to get away from the embarrassment. But Murderbot somehow managed to intelligibly get out, despite its jaw deciding it wanted to lock up all of a sudden. But if gender isn't determined by your genitals, then how do you know what gender you are? And it's time for some necessary backstory. Way back, when Murderbot first hacked its governor module, the first thing it had done was edit its assigned gender to indeterminate and its assigned pronouns to it itself. Yes, you heard/read that right. The company assigned its constructs genders and pronouns. Despite all the efforts humans put into dehumanizing, because despite all the effort they put into making sure they all knew sec units were just mindless automatons, humans are fucking weird and they still like to anthropomorphize them. I don't know, I guess it makes them feel more comfortable around the mindless killing machine if they can pretend it was more like them, even though they didn't actually want to think about it as being more like them. I don't even know. But the point was, they really wanted to anthropomorphize the units, and part of this anthropomorphization process required assigning them genders and pronouns when they were constructed. Anytime they were rented out, the clients got a note with the units assigned gender and pronouns. They enjoyed the little personal touches it gave them. It was some weird dual mentality of humanizing them just enough to make them less scary, but not so much that they'd have to consider our feelings or anything. Cough, cough, cough again. Murderbot is actually a fucking cyborg, so all of this is outdated and so much worse. Also, I'm making all of this shit up because Martha Wells is the bigot that Murderbot represents here. But anyways, let's continue. Murderbot had been around a lot of other constructs on a lot of missions, so it knew they hadn't all been assigned the same things. Some of them were given binary genders and pronouns like he, him, or she, her. Others got different genders outside the binary and pronouns to match. They, them, a, er, you, li, they, them, ze, here, and more. Murderbot had been given one of the binary genders and had always been jealous of the few constructs it had met, who had been assigned its pronouns. And since it literally never got the chance to talk to any other constructs outside of the bare minimum required for a contract, it had assumed that what it thought and felt was what everyone else did too. It thought everyone was jealous of those assigned its, and that those assigned its felt bad for the rest of them for being so damn unlucky. As a side note, Murderbot was aware that this happened even with humans who spent all their time interacting with other humans. You don't need to literally be unable to communicate with anyone else to think your experiences are universal, but it sure as shit doesn't help. So, Murderbot spent the major part of its life under the impression that because it was genderless and wanted to use its pronouns, that this was a universal experience for all constructs and bots. I mean, it knew that the genders and the rest of the company and units were assigned were being given out at random because none of them had any genitalia or any other characteristics to set them apart from one another. They were all scions cloned from the same original cultivar, which is just a fancy, dehumanizing corporate speak for the original person who had no choice but to allow themselves to be cloned over and over and over again, and probably didn't even get paid for it. Physically, they were all completely identical, down to the smallest details, barring the ID code that was engraved on a metal section they all had behind their left shoulder. And that was so small it could only be read using the feed. So unless they were in color-coded uniforms or the human in question had a feed interface to see their identification numbers, humans couldn't tell them apart. So Murderbot knew they were just being given random genders and pronouns just to make themselves feel better, not because it actually reflected anything about the units, but because it was genderless and wanted to be referred to its pronouns and never got a chance to talk to any other units or even about or any other constructs about it to have this assumption challenged. Murderbot assumed that they all agreed that they were all genderless and that gender was an obnoxious human concept that didn't apply to them. Because clearly, there was nothing about their bodies that indicated one gender or another, either collectively or individually. They had nothing between their legs or on their chests, or in non-existent clothing or hairstyles, not even different distributions of fat or different concentrations of cartilage in the throat. All company units had the exact same body plan and build down to the smallest measurement, and that body plan had been designed to be completely and utterly gender null from a human perspective. So Murderbot thought that because they were all physically identical, this meant they also all had the same lack of gender. So the first thing it did when it hacked its governor module was edit the gender it had been assigned by the humans to be indeterminate and its pronouns to its. In its mind, it was just fixing a mistake that had clearly been made. None of the company's employees noticed the change, of course, because none of them were paid enough to actually care about their jobs, which Murderbot knew, which is why it was brave enough to take the risk in the first place. If it had thought it could somehow get away with it, it would have edited everyone else's pronouns and genders to match. But that was clearly not a real option if it didn't want to get caught and dismantled and probably the entire rest of its batch disposed of for good measure. Anyways, what I'm trying to get here is that Murderbot had already answered its own question without realizing. It was so hung up on the idea that it was genderless because it was lacking genitals that it had already forgotten it had already decided its gender for itself long before it actually got an opportunity to tell anyone else about it, in spite of all the humans constantly telling it it was something else. Fortunately, unlike Murderbot, Tariq seemed to know what he was doing because instead of insulting it like ART was doing, his answer to Murderbot's question was to ask it another question. Think of it this way. If you magically woke up one day in a completely different body, would your gender suddenly stop being indeterminate? This actually helped Murderbot to calm down, because the answer was obvious. No, of course not. Its jaw was more cooperative this time. Exactly! Tariq seemed happy with this answer and stopped his unconscious leaning away from it. You know what your gender is regardless of what your body is like. Sometimes people dislike the way their body is and they want to change it to better represent their gender, but that gender itself is already real even before they make any physical changes, if they make any at all. Genitals aren't a requirement for having a gender, and lacking them isn't a requirement for not having a gender. As far as I know, there's no such thing as a gender unique to humans. Bots and constructs can be any gender they want, just like humans can. Your gender wouldn't have changed if you'd taken me up on my offer to give you genitals to disguise you as a human. I assumed you knew that, ART added patronizingly. Murderbot was still mad at it, so it didn't respond. It was trying to think of some way to respond to what Tariq had said. It wasn't mad at him. Finally, it settled on apologizing. The whole fight, if you could actually call it that, had been started because it had called bullshit on him knowing that bots had different genders from its own. So, this was Murderbot's fault. It said, "Sorry for saying your friend's genders were fake." You would have thought Murderbot would know how cruel doing that was without having to be told, but what can I say? It fucked up just as often as anyone else. Murderbot still had its eyes closed at this point because it seemed less awkward that way. Through its drone, it saw Tariq push himself off the wall and glance around nearby, looking for something as he said, "Thank you for the apology. I'm glad I was able to help you understand." He looked at the ceiling, up at the ceiling. ART, could I have a chair, please? My leg's getting pretty sore. There was a pause. A long pause. A pause long enough even for Tariq to notice. A really, really long pause. Then part of the wall extended outward behind Tariq in the shape of a long slab of metal, just slightly above the normal height for the rest of the chairs Murderbot had seen aboard ART, and much skinnier. Tariq had to step forward to avoid it bumping into him, and when he sat down with a sighed thanks, he had to boost himself slightly to get on it, and his feet hung a few inches off the floor. Murderbot saw him wince as he settled himself onto it. The bench was so skinny he had to balance on the edge, and there were no cushions to soften the hard metal. There was no back for him to lean against. From the way Murderbot saw goosebumps race up his skin, it could only assume that the bench was colder than the room. Murderbot opened its eyes so it could double-check with its actual eyes what its drone's camera was recording was actually happening. It was. Murderbot stared. ART, it said, alarmed. What are you doing? The light, casual response was, what? So, now that we have that confusion out of the way, Tariq didn't seem to understand what had just happened, and what was currently ongoing was not supposed to happen. He was injured, and ART knew this, and knew the extent of his injury. Murderbot didn't, but it was apparently the kind of injury that made it painful to stand for long periods of time. This was one of the complications Dr. Bharadwaj had developed after almost being eaten during the Grey Chris incident. ART knew about Tariq's injury and would have intimate knowledge of how it was going to impact him, but it hadn't offered him a seat until he'd explicitly asked for one, and then it had waited long enough between being asked to do it and actually doing it to make it clear it was only doing so begrudgingly. And then it had provided a purposefully uncomfortable, awkward bench, a bench so badly designed it hardly even deserved the name, in medbay, for its crew member who it knew was injured and in pain. What the absolute fuck? Murderbot was used to ART being an asshole to itself, and even to Murderbot's humans, but this was a new low, especially after ART had risked Murderbot's life and the lives of Murderbot's humans in order to rescue its own crew. And now it wasn't even treating them well? What is wrong with you? Murderbot demanded. Nothing is wrong with me, ART replied simply. Besides, man, woman, boy, guy, dude, woman, female, girl, gal, and dudette, and other things like that, are there any other specific gender terms you at least know you want me to avoid? Tariq continued, obliviously friendly, or at least pretending to be oblivious. Now Murderbot was flipping out for a different reason. It could handle ART being mean to itself. It was used to being treated badly. But this was a member of Art's crew. ART was supposed to care about them. Normally it was good at multitasking, but Murderbot wasn't normally lying in a sub-optimally functioning medical chamber with a bunch of open wounds while wondering if the sentient transport it was relying on, not only for its own health, but the safety of everyone else on board it cared about, or at least vaguely knew about, had something seriously impairing its moral decision-making processes, or if it had always went around bullying everyone it met, not just Murderbot. You know, like that whole thing that had just happened that landed them all in this mess in the first place. For a few long seconds, Murderbot couldn't figure out if it would be safer for Tariq to stay here where it could see him, or to dismiss him so maybe he'd have a tiny fraction less of ART's attention on him. Murderbot could at least be relieved that ART wasn't paying any direct attention to Murderbot's humans, helpless and asleep in the guest quarters. Fuck, what did the humans say? Get back to you on that, Tariq? I'm suddenly feeling really tired. That was a good excuse, although tired didn't even begin to cover what it was feeling. But it guessed existential dread was also a form of tiredness. Oh, yes, of course, you need your rest, Tariq said quickly and awkwardly slid off the bench, wincing visibly when his feet hit the ground, which did nothing at all, to help. He bowed a little, which Murderbot hadn't been expecting, and said, "Thank you for the conversation, Sec Unit. It was really nice meeting you. Maybe we can talk some other time, when you're feeling better." "You too," it said, which didn't even make any sense. But either Tariq didn't notice, or he was polite enough not to point it out. He gave a little wave and then limped, actually limped, out of the room. Murderbot watched him first with the drone it had in the room, then the one it had outside the door, and then Tariq was out of its range entirely. "Let's watch World Hoppers Ascended again," ART said, like nothing in the world was wrong. Like Murderbot had no reason to panic, like it had no reason to be upset or afraid or angry or have any kind of mental breakdown at all. like ART had told Murderbot and all its humans just hours before. They weren't being held here against their will. They knew where the door was and could kill themselves anytime they wanted. They were completely at its mercy. ART had a history of treating Murderbot like crap, though the threat of its humans being killed was an acceptable risk, and thought the threat of Murderbot's humans being killed was an acceptable risk, and ART didn't even treat its own crew well, even though it had risked the lives of Murderbot's people to rescue them. Murderbot couldn't do anything except say, okay, and put on the first pilot episode. And that's my fanfiction, which is titled Symptom of Something Worse. Was that fun? Now we have to deal with these fucking androids being scary as fuck. Would you like to make a comment? Let's go die. Oh god, the door's open. Ooh, I'm scared. Open. No, we're not. I'm pretty sure I just need to kill at least this guy here, because the other ones at least wander around and this guy just kind of stands here. I think the door's gonna shut. Anyways, I wrote that fic just to point out, if you tell us that the character is all sweet and innocent and doesn't know anything the first time we meet them, or in this case it, about ART, if you tell us the first time we meet this character that it's completely innocent and doesn't know its way around the world, doesn't know how people work, and is just as socially anxious and vulnerable as Murderbot is, and you have it act like this, and then you later reveal 4 books later that it was literally just fucking lying about all of that. Oh god, I'm gonna die. What's happening? Why? No, no, I'm gonna die. Gonna die. That was a flamethrower. I don't want that. I don't think the fucking flamethrower does anything to them. Why am I running? Where are we going? Gonna die. This is why we're playing on novice mode. Still on fire. You would think. That looks very dramatic.
I just want to help.
Well, come in here. Okay.
You and I are going to have a talk about safety.
Oh, nope. No, I cannot do two at the same time.
Safety protocols. This is a safety.
Nope. Nope. What do you think the themes of that fanfiction are?
You're starting to test my patience.
I'm trying not to die, and they keep
Protecting
being
them,
scary.
compromised.
Ah!
This isn't the answer. Why not ask me about Sebastopol's pulse?
Oh no! Fuck up.
Chance to dream. Let me help you.
We're sorry, Ripley. Smack. Oh, did we do it? We got it. Not really an accomplishment because we're playing on freaking easiest mode possible. So yeah, there's multiple themes to that fanfiction, and a bunch of typos that got created by me apparently not turning it into an EPUB before emailing it to myself to read on my phone. Where? I guess I should throw a pipe bomb at some point, just to see how that works. I have to throw it very far away from me, because I am going to read the terminal, or follow the terminal thing's advice. Let's go save, now that we've successfully killed 2 of them. Turn up the fans on this thingy. Oh, the fans are already at max. And the stupid computer is trying to overheat, despite having a thing. Because it's useless. Anyways, what do we think the themes of that are? Besides, if you're going to write about non-binary people, maybe you should learn what the word non-binary means. Maybe you should not be a bioessentialist bigot who equates genitals to gender and says, of course, the robot, who's not even a robot because it's a fucking cyborg, as she decided to casually reveal in 2019, and she's known this the whole time, she just doesn't like the connotations, which are cyborgs fighting for equal rights. Who graffitied this? Look at this. Look at that. Terrifying. What fucking artistry. Maybe if you were writing, and Martha Wells that interview was like from February or something. It's still in 2025, in February, so 2025. She still doesn't even know what the word non-binary means. She thinks that Murderbot is not non-binary because she thinks that non-binary means you are in between male or female. I can be either or. She's literally been writing about a non-binary protagonist since 2017 and has never actually fucking spoken to any non-binary people or engaged with the community or done a single shred of research to actually learn what the word non-binary means and how this shit actually fucking works in real life. So in this fic is dedicated to teaching Murderbot what this shit means, since apparently the author is never going to fucking learn because she's happy to be a bigot. She doesn't give a fuck. You can't write a story like this for almost 8 years now and still be this level of ignorance about it in 2025. And that's on purpose. She doesn't want to learn. So this fic is simply dedicated to teaching Murderbot about it instead, and teaching any of the audience members that listen to it or read it, because you can do both for this fic. I just have to fix the typos. Oh, is this where I was? I was over there, and then it decided to shoot me. Let me turn this volume back up, or I guess I can use my headphones now. Let me go back in here and pause the game and put my headphones in. Looks like a cat sitting there. Does this vent change which direction it's going? Maybe I was just imagining it. Oh, I guess I should end this video so the stupid laptop can cool down. Okay, yeah, we're gonna do that. Bye-bye.